ourselves to say, well, welcome to our recorded event, to make sure that we hit the record button. It's great for everybody who's joining us on this sunny, well, what is certainly in the middle of England as a sunny May morning. You're all very welcome, whether we've got people joining us from North and South Staffordshire, different parts of England, as well as from Scotland, Wales. And we're delighted to have colleagues joining us from Canada. And I think we're hoping also to have people joining from Italy as well. So everybody is very welcome. What we've got here is the title of both our overall series and today's particular event. And these two events, today's first one, have been a long time in the making. We're slightly later than we've been in previous years in organising these events, and we'll say more about perhaps process and events later. But we want to start by actually looking at the focus of today, which, as you can see, I'm not going to go through line by line, but just to highlight what we're looking at particularly today is space and place for the arts in radical lifelong learning, with a particular focus on contemporary and historical experiences in the Potteries in Stoke-on-Trent, in the centre of England. So I'm Ian Jones, joined in the introduction today and as a co-convener by my colleague Sharon Clancy, who initiated all of our work, and we will say more about that shortly. The next slide just gives a very brief introduction to what we're going to be doing this morning. Do I have the permission?
No, I'll do it, Ian. I'm just.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah, so no worries.
So if you go to the second slide before we get to here we go. So these are two related events. Today's event has a particular focus on Stoke-on-Trent, and we are then going to be running a second online event in September with a focus on various experiences in Wales, and also including other perspectives as well. So what are we doing today? Today we've got this short introduction, then followed by a keynote by Lyndon, and then we're going to open up to a discussion which will be perhaps combining particular questions raised by Lyndon's presentation, along with two questions that we will shortly put into the chat thread. So today, as I said earlier, we welcome everybody participating, and in our invitation, we invited activists and artists in Stoke-on-Trent, and we've had some very useful contacts with some of those participants, as well as those of you joining us today. So what I thought would be useful, because we've got a combination of people who've been to events before and perhaps people joining us for the first time, having briefly set that scene, I'm just going to hand to Sharon to provide perhaps the context and the background about where these events come from. So Sharon, did you want to?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian, and thanks. Great to see everybody here. So for those who don't know the background to the Research Circle events, and apologies for those who've heard this several times before, but we thought the context was really important. So people will probably be aware of the Centenary Commission report on adult education, which was undertaken by a group of commissioners, culminating in a report in 2019, which you can see here. The more modern looking document is a permanent national necessity, adult education and lifelong learning, in the 21st century Britain. And that followed on, the intention was to try and identify some of the key developments in adult education over the course of 100 years since the original seminal 1919 report on adult education, to chart some of the developments, some of the changes, which are of course enormous, and some of the continuities and between those two periods, 1919 and 2019. So the document is about 6 years old now, but we still reference it actively. The idea was, and I'll move on to the next slide to demonstrate this, back in 2019, once we'd focused the report, we looked at a number of different aspects of the report, including focus area 3, with the view that it might be useful to start developing smaller networks to undertake key actions and take forward some of the key themes coming out of the report. And the one that seems to have captured the imagination is this one: fostering community democracy and dialogue. So following an event at the Cooperative College in 2020, supported by the Cooperative College, we decided we would develop a research circle specifically focusing on fostering community democracy and dialogue, feeling it was absolutely vital at that particular point in the history of adult education, with all the cuts and the impacts of austerity in the UK, but always intended as an online forum, a network, so we could come together as a space of, we thought, a resource of hope in very difficult times. And of course, this coincided with the COVID period. So it was pretty vital. For many of us, I think it's been a real lifeline. I know I've certainly found that to have these spaces 2 or 3 times a year, generally 3 times a year, where we come together to discuss enriching and important radical and participatory threads around adult education. So the first series of events took place in 2021 in May, July and September. All these events, by the way, are on the Raymond Williams Foundation YouTube site. If you do have a yen to look back over previous events, they are extremely rich, powerful. We've had all kinds of discussants, people from all kinds of backgrounds presenting at our events, and they've been very dialogic. That's always been the intention. 2022, we looked at democracies in crisis, again, a series of 3 events. And the 3rd and 4th series were very much focused around building dialogue, particularly around a learning democracy. And finally, last year, we started to think about backwards travellers looking forwards, the idea that history can both inform the present, but also help shape the future. And so that was the focus of last year's events in particular. Quite a lot of focus too on the imagination and the arts last year as well. And that has then enabled us to think more actively about the arts in place. So I'll leave my bit there, Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I mean, I thought we thought very briefly it was important just to pick up that issue there about the different forms of events we've organised and audiences. So, for example, in 2024, we kind of combined Sharon and I did a presentation at a national international research conference, but also spoke at a face-to-face TUC event, which was on workers' education with learning reps. And then we had an event in November, which was our final event of 2024 online, where Lyndon and Sharon spoke with a particular focus on workers' education. So all the time, what we're trying to do is play around with the pros and cons of online and face-to-face events. And again, that process is perhaps something we can pick up in the second half. But we were very aware of how that applies to today's event as well. Sharon, Lyndon and I met on Wednesday, and we were just kind of talking through this, and we just wanted to emphasize that for today, for example, we invited, as I said earlier, various artists and activists from Stoke, and it's been very helpful that although we can't be joined today by Anna Francis from the Portland Inn Project and the University of Staffordshire, and Claire White from Centre Space Arts, who's a member of the research circle. Although neither of us can join today, we've very much welcomed their contributions to our thinking, and we hope that they're going to join us in September at the second online event that we're going to be organising. Just to, I think it's the 5th slide, Sharon. Have we got that? At the moment, I've got that horrendous thing of just looking at myself. But at the heart of each of the events, I spoke about the event that we organised in November, for example, and previous events. At the heart of each of these events has been a combination of stories and histories, life stories and life histories. And that is something that for us has always been about, that relationship between individual and collective struggle. And that underlying theme has never been more powerful than in today's presentation. So what I wanted to do was welcome Lyndon, who is known to the vast majority of people, but just to say, Lyndon, Emeritus Professor at Canterbury Christ Church, who's going to lead the first part of today's event. Many of you know Lyndon's has had a long and distinguished career and critically researching lifelong and life-wide learning. And that is as equally important as today is the fact that he's also talking about Stoke-on-Trent, the city of his birth. So that hopefully what Sharon and I have done is provided some form of context. Perhaps what we could do, Sharon, is just have these 2 questions up. If you agree, Lyndon, would you like people to have those questions now or at the end of your presentation?
No, do it now.
Yeah.
I'll put them in the chat straight away.
Okay, so what we're going to do is highlight those in the chat thread. I'll hand over to Lyndon, who's going to speak for approximately 40-45 minutes. We'll then take a break, a pause for 10 minutes. And what we would like in that pause is you just have a chance to reflect on both Lyndon's presentation, but also these 2 questions in the chat thread. And then in the second half, we wanted to blend response to Lyndon and your reflections on the 2 questions. So that's the structure that we've got. Hopefully that makes sense. And I'd now like to warmly welcome Lyndon and his presentation. Over to you, Lyndon.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Sharon. And good morning, good afternoon, or whatever it is to everyone. It's an honour, actually, to be able to talk about issues that have been fundamental to me and which I've written and reflected on over a long period. It's also an honour to talk about the place I come from in that context. And although this talk is very particular, I think in the particular we can find examples of the universal, and that will be one of the themes I'll be exploring. Particular thanks to those perhaps who've come today from Stoke, because I know there's a lot of competition for your attention today. For any old or new rockers amongst you, a sculpture by Andy Edwards is being unveiled of legendary Motorhead frontman Lemmy Kilmister in Burslem, in the north of the city where he was born. A portion of his ashes is being placed into the plinth, and there's a big cavalcade in his honour. Lemmy, like me, is a child of Stoke. There's a rich heritage here of diverse kinds. So I was born in this city in a place called Abbeyhalton, a public housing estate, and went to the local primary school. This is important. We were taken on a trip to Belgium and Holland. Quite unusual, I think, for that time. But a strong international... Can you go back to the first slide, Sharon? You're running ahead of me.
Sorry, Linda, my PC's frozen, so I'm having a bit of a moment with it. So I'll try and go back ASAP.
Yep, okay. So just to repeat that, a strong internationalist spirit has surfaced in Stoke from time to time. I went to the local grammar school, Hanley High School, and then to Keele University. So I just pause a moment. There we are. Shall I carry on? And then I went to Keele University, which many of you will know is close by the Potteries. After graduation, I worked in university adult education at Keele for a while. Can we still go back to the first slide? It seems to have a life of its own, this PowerPoint, Sharon. That's it. So after graduation, I worked in university adult education for a while at Keele. And now, after a long journey, I'm Professor Emeritus at Canterbury Christ Church University in Kent, and have been visiting professor at the universities of Paris-Nanterre, Milan-Bicocca, and Michigan State. Note the internationalism again. My interests are as a historian, life historian, or what I now call auto/biographical narrative research. These are the core of what I do. I have been a psychoanalytic psychotherapist too. But despite all of this, if you take the lad out of Stoke, you can't take Stoke out of the lad. And that's why I'm here. And maybe something similar applies to Lemmy. In 2008 to 2015, I researched and wrote a book on distress in this city and my own distress in relation to it. 2009, a mosque was pipe bombed. A taxi driver of South Asian origin was murdered on the street. Politics were in disarray, and the racist, some say fascist, British National Party was representing my old estate on the city council and threatening to take control of the whole council in the 2010 municipal elections. I thought back to my childhood and a culture relatively of healthy municipalism. It was embodied in a bright, new housing estate into which my parents had moved and where I grew up. It was a new Jerusalem to them, with gardens, fresh air, and after the war, free healthcare, alongside a commitment to education, including adult education. The culture was industrial, for better as well as worse. From Hanley, the centre of Stoke, I could see Etruria and Josiah Wedgwood's original house there. I could see Shelton Bar belching iron and steel production. And now, in my imagination, I remember an organised working class in unions, a tradition of autodidacticism and workers' education, and a strong social democratic tradition. It had died, more or less, by 2008. I began gathering stories in various communities to make sense of things, using, as I say, auto/biographical narrative methods, which I promise to explain in a moment. I draw on what I call various theoretical friends to help me better understand the complex stories people tell. The friends include psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, German sociologist Axel Honneth, as well as Raymond Williams. Winnicott talked of the fundamental importance of love, or unconditional regard, grounded in his clinical work with families after the Second War, of the fundamental embodied importance of feeling listened to and understood, of being cared for and celebrated as a human being. Honneth took these ideas further by emphasizing the importance of the socio-cultural in human flourishing. of feeling socially accepted, of experiencing reciprocity and belonging, combined with experiences of satisfying participation in good, educative, diverse, and dialogical groups, to repeat that word again that Sharon was mentioning earlier. And through being encouraged to take responsibility when we are ready, from which a vibrant selfhood can be forged. Honneth, drawing on American educator John Dewey, considers these to be the building blocks of human flourishing and participative democracy. And then there's Raymond Williams, adult educator, cultural writer, novelist. I love his writing, or some of his writing. I know he's a bit unfashionable, but I think it pays a great deal to read novels like Border Country. Williams wrote that culture is ordinary. Every human society has its own shape, its own purposes, its own meanings. Culture has two aspects: the known meanings and directions which its members are trained to, and then second, spaces for making new observations, maybe radically challenging ones, and for forming new relationships, comparisons, connections, meanings, interpretations, and value judgments. In the arts and significant learning, for instance, and maybe in some religious and therapeutic communities. In thinking back to my childhood, I recall a passion for challenging orthodoxy and creating new meaning in my own family. Great Uncle Joe was self-taught and thoroughly eclectic in his reading, a passionate autodidact, enthusiastic about the arts and philosophy. Uncle Jack was nonconformist, questioning the established religious and cultural order. Both could at times be overly insistent in a point of view. There is, I think, a potential zealot in us all, and there's a fine line between lifelong learning and zealotry. Culture, then, for Williams, encompassed ordinary common meanings alongside the finest individual ones. The making of the good society, in his eyes, is an imaginative, fundamentally educative process of creating more inclusive common meanings and social directions, a kind of exercise of imaginative freedom cultivated in art, active discussion, serious thinking, and a dialectic of ideas and experience. Culture, he said, is written into the land, a town, and people's hearts and their stories, like Joe's and Jack's. It can take collective form in educational settings, in seeking truth in the company of friends, to take the University of Kiel's motto. In the face, perhaps, of abusive religious hierarchy, nationalist jingoism, or fascist fundamentalism of times past, or in our own contemporary struggles against authoritarianism, nationalist populism, fascism, Trumpism, Islamist, and market fundamentalism. For Williams, this sense of a participative learning democracy, a long revolution, was forged from the bottom up, contrasted with the more normal tendency to see folk as a slow, ignorant mass to be managed and manipulated, whether on the political left or the right, or for money-making perhaps, as well as the building of a so-called progressive but essentially top-down managerialist politics. The poor, often treated by the marketeers and some politicians as deviant and responsible for their own condition, or simply too ignorant for their own good. There were troubling times in 1925, as there are now, It was a short step from the traumas of World War I. We understand trauma and its longevity better now. There was no inevitability about progressive cultural and political advance. We too must seek to make new meanings and actions or recover things of value in our past in the face of the echo chambers of social media, war, October the 7th, Gaza and the West Bank, Sudan, Kashmir, Trump, authoritarianism, fascism, neoliberalism, and the fragility of our home, the poly-crisis, if you like, of our times. Let me say something about researching, if I may, as I promised to. Auto/biography and narrative research, what are these? Biographical research seeks to understand the complexity of who we are, our motives and experience in the context of whole lives. The auto refers to how, when working with others, we draw on our own experiences and selves, like it or not. We can do so, however, reflexively, carefully, and in depth to make better sense of others' lives and, incidentally, of our own. When we research in this kind of relational way, we better appreciate a shared, vulnerable, but also resilient humanity. When you meet Carol and Raf in this talk, maybe you and I will recognize something of ourselves too, in their vulnerability and the attractions of fascism or Islamic fundamentalism. I'm also reminded of Czech novelist Milan Kundera's observation that the struggle against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. Research can be an act of recovery and contribute to the potential creation of new common meanings. Stoke and North Staffordshire were once home to vibrant mining communities. When 30 years later, visitors from the Czech Republic arrived at a school in a former mining community to talk about what their grandparents had done in the Second World War, a little boy, as we will see, raised his hand to ask, "Please, sir, what's a mine?" The process encourages interdisciplinary imagination, connecting culture and inner worlds, and dialogue between sociology and psychology on the importance of relationship and intersubjectivity in the quality of subjective life. This is a form of research like psychoanalytic psychotherapy, seeking good enough space for storytelling. It doesn't retreat from emotional life or the messiness of lived experience, but rather, like the good novelist or visual artist, to encompass it and give it vivid expression. Do we have the next slide, please, Sharon? So 2025 and 2019, as Ian and Sharon explained, are significant dates. Stoke celebrates its centenary this year. It became a county borough, at the time the highest tier of local government, in 1910, when the 6 pottery towns, Tunstall, Burslem, Hanley, Stoke-upon-Trent, to the eternal confusion of the outside world, Stoke-upon-Trent, as distinct from Stoke-on-Trent, Fenton and Longton, they federated. A process in which ordinary folk, including worker students, played an important role. 2019, as Sharon explained, was a centenary year too. The report from the Ministry of Reconstruction was published that year. It declared, again to repeat, that adult education was a permanent national necessity. I think the report sought a kind of honouring of the dead, as well as the living, in the light of World War I. Stoke has an honoured place in the report, as I'll explain, even if ultimately the imagination dimmed. The 1919 report inspired people in universities and diverse voluntary organizations and churches to create more of a culture of shared common meanings, and to build the kingdom on earth, to use some of the religious language of the time. In 1908, the first ever Oxford University Workers' Education Association tutorial classes were held, one in Longton that became part of Stoke, and Rochdale in Lancashire, and taught by subsequently distinguished economic and cultural historian Richard Henry Tawney, representing the University of Oxford. More of him a little later. Here were worker students wanting more than lectures, seeking to bring their own lived experience and desires into educational processes, and to find tutors who would be sympathetic to them and their struggles. Tawney was one of a coterie of Oxford dons at the beginning of the last century, longing for reform of universities, to make them more inclusive and, yes, serious, and to create a university presence in every town and city. We might nowadays ask a question about the contemporary place of universities in cities like Stoke. The good news is that there are still academics with a commitment to the common good and liberating artistic expression. We might also think and talk about Stoke as a microcosm of many other, quote, Rust Belt, unquote, communities across the Western world, post-industrial. And I hear stories almost every day now of another pottery closing, democratically moribund, to be contentious, and where populism, fascism can on occasions flare up once more. But these are places too easily disdained, thought passé, and overly dependent in the eyes of some dominant, largely ignorant cultural elites. Can we have the next slide, Sharon? So when I came home, as it were, back to Stoke from 2008 onwards, mining, steel making and pottery had been in steep decline for 3 decades, as Thatcherism and neoliberal assumptions took hold. The state and the public realm were defined as the problem. The market was deified, nothing compared with its capacity to translate human need into materialistic desire and consumption, or greed into capital accumulation, creative destruction, and rampant inequality. Here was the new religion. I thought of patterns of migration. One side of my own family migrated to the expanding Potteries from South Staffordshire in the 1860s. I wonder sometimes how it was all for them. 100 years later, from the 1960s onwards, 9,000, quote, Muslim and other people from Pakistan and, note, Kashmir migrated to Stoke too, often into low-skilled jobs but paying relatively abundant wages compared to back home. By 2008, if not before, politics had become dysfunctional. Labour was unable to recruit councillors from the estate where I grew up, while less than 10% of eligible people might vote in local elections. If industry had largely unravelled, judgmentalism filled the vacuum. Places like Stoke were labelled failures, peopled, it seemed, sometimes by benefit cheats, the listless and dependent. An increasingly defensive, even solipsistic working class culture emerged, while different working class communities, predominantly white or Muslim, had little everyday contact. The other came to be a problem, no doubt over time, exacerbated by social media. Unemployment now spanned 3 generations. High levels of mental distress, 1 in 3 families, was evident too. The psychological spirit level, in epidemiologists Wilkinson and Pickett's phrase, was low. This is not simply to do with unemployment and rapid deindustrialization, as important as these were, but also growing inequality and the conspicuous display of success in the diverse temples and mediations of capitalist consumption. There was also the associated weakening of working class self-help institutions and traditions, like workers' education and the arts. Where now were the spaces for processing difficult experience and for learning to talk back to power creatively and assertively? There is something more. The Pathfinder project from 2008 to 2010, using ironically the same name adopted for the mass bombing of German cities in World War II, here in Stoke, houses were demolished, but in this instance, unlike Germany, never replaced. Hanley in the centre of the city, became a mass of car parks where communities once thrived. In Abbey Holton, a community regeneration project was abandoned as austerity bit deeply under a new coalition government. Hopes raised, then devastated. Abandonment is a good word for this, for which a heavy price continues to be paid. I first met Carol, this is a pseudonym, in 2008. She told me about her own mental health issues and a fire at an Asian shop opposite where she lived, and of gangs and druggies terrifying her. A mental distress encompassed depression and hospitalization and the loss of a husband who died shortly after the last mine closed in 1985. No talking cures here. She talked of keeping your head in a bucket to feel safe. Then the British National Party called and really cared, she said, dealing with the druggies and a broken gate and tiles on the roof. Soon after followed the story of the asylum seeker moving in close by, as she herself was deeply bothered by her son struggling to find work in Stoke. Move to Manchester, he was told, if you want a job, and take your family with you, which of course would have included Carol's grandchildren. Asylum seekers becoming threatening others. We'll return to Carol's story in a moment. The next slide, Sharon, please. So, in certain Muslim communities, people like Raf, and that's again a pseudonym, in Arabic it means companion, told stories of everyday disrespect and Islamophobia, with assaults on Asian taxi drivers on the white estates. Notions of intuitive justice violated in these everyday microaggressions, as Axel Honneth put it. There was the firebombing of the Central Mosque near Hanley Park, where my parents once played tennis. The park had been a monument to municipal socialism, but was now lying bereft and vandalized. Stories were told of lost economic and cultural worlds, of fractures across the generations, and of older and younger Muslim men losing role and hope. The pot bank might once have represented a transitional space for fathers and sons, where a dad could proudly introduce a son to a job, a sense of self-worth, and material security in a rite of passage, now long gone. In the mosques, over time, other intergenerational fractures had emerged. There were imams recruited from back home, sometimes poorly educated with little English. And then, among new generations growing up in the city, for whom English was the first language, there was increasing denigration of older generations, and imams struggling with the language and refusing to speak out. Bosnia had arrived. or more specifically Srebrenica, a huge turning point. Bosnia proved the point that the real attack was against Islam itself, as people like Raf saw it, given the victims were white. And then we had, of course, the Crusades of the Willing against Islam post-2001, the consequences of which continue to haunt. Raf told a story of becoming a jihadi. I should make clear that Raf's is an amalgam of various stories, partly anonymized for ethical reasons, but retaining, I believe, interpretive integrity and a kind of narrative truth. The family difficulties, alienation from his father, and drugs, and finding recognition, radicalization in prison, in a gang of his own, in Adam Phillips' provocative phrase, a kind of tutorial class, but with closed fundamentalist purpose, in which finally there was only one truth, and nothing but that truth. But it helped build self-confidence, self-respect, and esteem, if ultimately premature closure. Raf moved to what he saw as a caring role with young people and divine purpose in Hizb ut-Tahrir, or Liberation Party. He travelled to Syria for a while. The storytelling pedagogy in these groups reached back centuries to the armies of Rome and past defeats of 12th century crusaders by Islamic armies. But ultimately the process was one of anti-thinking, anti-experience, closure, and the projection of everything that was wrong onto the white, corrupt other. A projection, in psychoanalytic terms, of the parts of culture we don't like in our own. The consequence is sectarianism rather than solidarity. The next slide, Sharon. The distress of 2008 onwards led me back to history and previous research I'd done on Richard Henry Tawney and the tutorial class movement in the early 1970s. I realized that I had too easily dismissed Tawney and his work and what previous generations had done. Things look different from 2010 or thereabouts in comparison to the 1970s. I wanted at that time to be accepted into my own gang of radical, seemingly uber-confident new Marxists writing on adult education in the 1970s. Tawney was seen as pious and atheoretical, and there is no greater sin than that in the academy. Coming across Jonathan Rose's work, grounded in life testimonies, helped me on my way. I first read The Intellectual History of the British Working Classes in 2010, when the second edition was published. Rose encouraged me back to Tawney and his, quote, experiment in democratic education on cold Friday evenings at the old Sutherland Institute in Longton. The workers' students, as I said, had felt dissatisfied with extension lectures. They wanted to shape what was studied and longed for dialogue and the interrogation of ideas in the light of experience. 30 working class learners and teachers, potters, miners, engineers, elementary school teachers eventually formed the first class. Tawney, they wrote, was the right man in the right place at the right time. Rose, methodologically, was spot on. Engage with and listen to their learners in their diaries, memorabilia, and autobiographical writing, etc., etc. Tawney, the Christian socialist, was central to the success of what became a movement. There's his photo on the slide. Patrician, rugby school, Balliol, and an Anglican. He married William Beveridge's sister, the Beveridge, that is, of the famous Report, and subsequently became a distinguished economic and cultural historian with his Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Philosophically, he was an Oxford idealist. He thought enlightened and active citizenship was the cornerstone of a meaningful democracy. Drawing on Victorian radicalism and the idealist philosophical tradition reaching back to Plato, Rousseau, Kant and Hegel, as well as Carlyle and the Romantic Coleridge, the idealists viewed society as a kind of spiritual community with an ethical purpose. Citizens would fulfill themselves by leading a civically active life, creating shared purpose, meaning, and a better world. Tawney was a Christian socialist practicing what he preached. It's interesting that members of the Marxist Social Democratic Federation formed a strong element of that first class. Theirs could be a slightly clunky, over-economistic, deterministic view of history in which individuals had little place. An SDFer one evening challenged Tawney by determinedly quoting from Marx's Das Kapital. The tutor, he said, was like a bird, hopping from branch to branch, twig to twig, in a tree. The student no doubt felt he had found the truth, and nothing but that truth, and that this Oxford intellectual refused to recognize it. And no doubt for a while a bad atmosphere pervaded the evening. But then taking tea afterwards and singing songs and quoting Walt Whitman restored conviviality. The student respected Tawney for encouraging him to think and consider other ways of seeing, and the dialogue continued. The best of liberal adult education. And what of the women and the gender question? There were several women in the first class, elementary school teachers in the main. They hated some of the politicking of the men, but came to love and respect the spirit and eclectic reading and recommendations of Tawney. And the literature they encountered, Thomas Hardy or the Romantics, later D.H. Lawrence and Tolstoy, moved hearts, souls, as well as minds. Out of these experiences came the North Staff's miners' higher education movement and other forms of civic activism. The North Staff's miners' higher education movement later morphed into the North Staff's district of the Workers' Education Association, all of which is celebrated in the 1919 report. And there's a picture of a page there on the right of the photos of the section on Stoke and its central importance in these developments. Several of the Longton tutorial class students, including some of the miners, were inspired to extend the work to mining communities across North Staffordshire. They transitioned from students to teachers in an important subjective and cultural process. Oxford historian Lawrence Goldman, in his historical judgment, talks of the ideals of fellowship, conviviality, enlightenment, and participatory democratic socialism as key and having a lasting relevance. Solidarity rather than meritocracy. The next slide. There's something else, a precious something, to return to the theme of internationalism. I've recently researched workers' education among the Kent miners, yet more forgotten history and memories, perpetual struggle. The international dimension of workers' education in these communities is often forgotten, which matters in the light of how many people years later voted for Brexit. Miners built solidarity with miners in diverse other countries, including what was then called Czechoslovakia. Powerful forms of self-other recognition and dialogue, but often lost to history. Reinhard Heydrich, author of The Final Solution of the Jewish Question, was assassinated in Prague on the 27th of May, 1942. Nazi terror units in revenge entered the Czech mining town of Lidice and shot or gassed men, women and children. Apart from a small number looking sufficiently Aryan who were deported to Germany to be raised by families of the Reich, the Nazis declared that Lidice shall die. The link between Stoke, Kent and Lidice and the Lidice shall live movement comes via the miners and the local Stoke councillor and general practitioner, Dr. Barnett Stross. In Stoke, in the summer of 1942, the miners and others organised a great public rally. Barnett Stross addressed the rally along with the exiled president of Czechoslovakia. Stross was later to become MP for Stoke Central in 1945. He was Jewish and his own family were refugees from pogroms. He was also a WA activist, tutor and close friend of Tawney. Stross was also my mum's GP. There's a rose garden at the Lidice Memorial in the Czech Republic, donated by the Kent miners, and the avenue to the memorial is called the Barnett Stross Way. A small number of survivors have regularly visited Stoke to honour the city. As I said earlier, as some school students prepared for a visit in an old Stoke mining community, that pupil asked, "Please, sir, what's a mine?" Barely 20 years had passed since the pit closed. The next slide, Sharon. So to the last but one slide, and back to Carol. Nothing perhaps is as ordinary as a sewing class, and yet Carol's story puts it centre stage in her slow movement from depression to community activism, and from fragile selfhood to feeling more loved, self-respecting, and becoming a community activist. A loving neighbour began to meet her every morning, and they agreed that she would walk 100 yards more each day to the next lamppost. Then, making it to the class, encouraging us to think of some of the alchemy that happens in these spaces, where there's space for stories, for art and creativity, for trying things out and making something recognized as beautiful, or at least good enough. The sheer conviviality of the good class and its importance in self-other recognition and health. And then for Carol, onto a local primary school and volunteering to hear a child reading, a little boy, coming to recognize her importance to him and he to her, weaving a thread connecting psychological health, self and other recognition, and community activism. Can we have the last slide, Sharon? So to conclude, history can be, in Raymond Williams' evocative phrase, resources of hope. History can be a resource of hope in the here and now. To realize what previous generations did in their own deeply troubled times can inspire. We look forwards, backwards, as it were, as Sharon puts it in some of her writing, to get the feel of history and alternative visions of culture and human possibility. History can come vividly to life. Hannah, our youngest daughter, visited Lidice a few years ago when she was working in Prague. We talked about Stoke and Lidice, sitting in the last synagogue in the old Jewish quarter there. It became for Hannah and us an important experience. A grandmother's family doctor intertwined with the awfulness and inspiration of history. I've spent only a little time researching in the contemporary city, but have listened to a variety of artists to realize where new resources of hope might lie. Arts projects in a city poorly served by spaces for artistic expression. Distress in the City, the book, ended on a positive note by reference to a WA organised project where white and Muslim working class women began to learn democracy together. Women in various communities, anxious about sticking heads above any parapet, became central to a protest movement against the closure of a local swimming pool. Learning to dialogue, to tell stories and listen, and thus to understand more of a common humanity, as well as inspirational activism in a world normally dominated by male others. I recently learned about Centre Space Arts, based now in the Smithfield Works in Hanley, near the museum and art gallery, and before that in the old Spode Works, where my mum once decorated pottery. I've talked to people like Claire, Darren, Sally and Sarah. Darren firmly resisting what he called corporatization and valuing artistic freedom in his struggle to celebrate Stoke. Darren's first big documentary project was called Memories of Spode. Keeping Stoke's history alive through film and photographic art. Sarah, from a working class background, finding her feet as a photographer and producing 100 photo essays of people connected to the city in this centenary year, me included. Charlotte Higgins, in The Guardian, who herself comes from Stoke, recently reminded us of projects like Portland Inn. The project has constructed a 100-year plan to reinvigorate a small area of 500 houses that had been condemned. Houses left over from the Pathfinder debacle, inspiring artist and academic Anna Francis and her partner. She bought one of the £1 houses on offer and began working with the community to convert an old pub into a centre for the arts and community regeneration, doing so from the bottom up. And then, in helping to formulate the 100-year plan, engaging with the work of Capability Brown and imagining how a beautiful and ecologically alive environment could be imagined in that space and realised. Imagining all this in a marginalised place where spaces have been allowed to degenerate and parks and gardens lost. Charlotte writes about people like Anna, quote, "What artists do is to dream up narratives," she says, stories. They imagine different futures. This is the power of what is happening, an exercise in radical democracy. And there on the slide is a statue of Arnold Bennett, the Stoke novelist, standing near the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery. It's being hugged by a Portland Inn participant, unfashionable Bennett, but someone whose work I also admire, embodying a creative literary imagination in his old wives' tale, connecting the life of a woman from Burslem, he calls Sophia Baines, with Paris, and she surviving inspirationally a deadening marriage, the Franco-Prussian War, and the Commune. Big and small worlds incarnated in literary art in which human agency and resilience are born in the face of despair. Like Darren, Claire, Sally, Lemmy too, Arnold B. and Charlotte, stories like these from people of Stoke in their various forms continue to inspire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lyndon. That was fascinating and very rich presentation, and I think it's fascinating to hear both familiar themes that we'd discussed before, but also new perspectives as well. If I could just say a very brief reflection before we then link perhaps to the questions and the break we were talking about. What I found fascinating was that relationship between that early history that you were talking about, both prior to and Stoke being featured within the 1919 report, other institutions like the North Staffs Miners Federation. You spoke about the WA, and in a sense the origins to do with Keel as well. So we've got a variety in terms of, to use a phrase from John Holford's research, around this idea of policy trails. There was a sort of a trail there in the origins of Stoke, and then to talk about those contemporary institutions that you had in your concluding slide. And I'm delighted today, as well as those organisations you spoke about, that we're joined by, is it Jill Rosano from the New Vic Theatre? So the role of theatre in Stoke is something that we can perhaps pick up on and discuss after the break. And I'm delighted that the New Vic Theatre is part and parcel of our discussion today. So if we were to go to Sharon, is it worth perhaps just pulling up those two, on I think it's the 5th or 6th slide from the introduction. If we had that on the screen, and then as we discussed with Lyndon on Wednesday, if this is okay, Lyndon, if you think this fits right, we'll pause now for that 10 minutes as we discussed. There we go. So those two questions that we've got there, and in bold, I was trying to just edit them down slightly. This is what we were interested in listening to, everybody's perspectives. But perhaps, again, if you agree, Lyndon, we'll start with responses to your presentation.
Yeah.
That was my kind of first reflection. And Lyndon, I don't know whether, just in terms of momentum and from a teaching point of view, are you happy to take those in 10 minutes, or did you want to take some responses to your presentation now? What feels best for you?
I mean, I think the idea of 10 minutes was just to give people space for a pause.
Yeah.
And think where the presentation, might have left them and what their responses might be to the questions on the screen now. I'm happy. I mean, if somebody is bursting to say something, Lyndon, that was wonderful. You've got it totally wrong, by the way. I'm open to that now as well. So.
Okay, we've been sitting together. We've been together for an hour. Let's go with what we discussed on Wednesday, Sharon. If you agree, we'll pause for 10 minutes. I'm making it now 5 minutes past 11. If everybody agrees, we'll just pause and reconvene in 11:15, and we'll start, Lyndon, with questions generated by that, as said there in the chat thread, that rich and it really was moving, thought-provoking presentation. So we'll do that. We'll meet again in 10 minutes time. Okay.
Yeah, and just to say, please don't leave. We'll just sort of go quiet for 10 minutes and just rejoin.
We'll open up in 10 minutes time. Okay. Thanks very much.
See you
then. Excellent, Lyndon. I really enjoyed that. That was, I thought that worked really well.
Thank you.
Yeah, it did. It did. And I think that by weaving in those references to those various projects that we're beginning to kind of find out about, that really opens up the possibility for involving people in September, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know, because some people I can't see, but in the participants, most people I know, you can see who they are. But there are a couple of people where I'm not sure whether we've got anybody from Centre Space Arts. You heard me name check the new Vic, which is great that we've got somebody from the theatre. It was Darren, wasn't it, who you were?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Darren, Sally, Claire, Sarah's here, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sarah's here with, she has direct connections working with Claire.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Sorry about the tech issues, by the way, Lyndon. I was having a problem. My PC totally froze.
Oh.
I couldn't move anything. So
toujours la même histoire.
I know it normally is fine, but it was just, I thought, oh my God, I just moved from the slides we were using with Ian and then to yours, and it suddenly froze. So apologies, I was messing around trying to get it to work. But
over the years,
as long as you could see it, that was the main thing.
We come to know and love these things, don't we?
Oh God, it's a nightmare. Your best laid plans, you're just thinking, oh no.
What was that famous occasion where we had a meeting? This was about 3-4 years ago, Sharon, where John took a phone call.
Oh yeah, that was great. Yeah,
we've got a meeting like this, and who was it? A phone call?
It was with his insurance or somebody.
Some insurance company.
And we could hear everything. It was really funny. I bet John remembers that as well. John's here, I think, somewhere.
It was hilarious.
Yeah, we've had all kinds of stuff.
So what's going on here?
God, you just think, oh no. So it's like, and then I thought, oh no, what else can people see? Is it actually working? But anyway, never mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we think about this timing, and this I think is going to work really well, isn't it? That I mean, yes, we had said originally, because we thought with the two presentations we'd go to 12:30. I mean, if you both agree, in that 45 minutes up till 12, what we could do is a blend of questions to you, Lyndon, people's thoughts about the two questions in the chat thread, and then Sharon, perhaps, that sense of what next with the
I could say something about
the September event. And if we cover those three, and aim to probably pull it together by 12, I think that does that. I don't want to rush it, but neither do I want to kind of stretch it out where we think we're.
No, that's absolutely fine. I think that's really good. I'm just going to pull up my brother's film so I can do a bit of let people know about it, basically, because hopefully people will be interested.
Oh, here we go. So this Jill from the New Vic has just put a comment in here. I've got my New Vic colleagues. Oh, excellent. Can you see this, Lyndon?
I'm just looking at the chat now.
Becky Salt and Brenda Hennessy, all working
very
on the
welcome.
Raymond Williams Theatre project, Sharon.
Brilliant. Yeah, fantastic. That is.
I mean, I know from John, who's my old school friend, who I'm staying with, Sharon, next week before we meet up. I mean, John, because his mum and dad are also from, and I think his dad passed away about 6 months ago, and his dad's from born and grew up in Hanley as well. And John regularly goes to the New Vic, and occasionally I dip into their programme, Lyndon, and I mean, what will be interesting is to get their perspectives, that a significant part of what they're doing still connects to that history of Peter Cheeseman. And
you took the name out of my head. Yeah. And I actually did drama at the Old Vic, amateur drama. And I knew Peter Cheeseman a little bit.
Yeah.
And of course his engagement with some of the issues of Stoke and ordinary folk was legendary. I was once giving a talk in Cyprus, and I might have mentioned in the talk, I tend to, Stoke, and afterwards this Canadian professor came up to me and said, Peter Cheeseman, and his eyes were blazing with delight, and he proceeded to talk about Peter and his influence for the next 15 minutes. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Peter is known and celebrated in many, many places.
Absolutely. The first play I remember was it The Fight for Shelton Bar, which was probably about 75, 76, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, look, we're coming up to 11:15. Most people are on mute still, but oh, have we got the power, Sharon, to us to unmute? It looks like I think we are. Whoops. I don't know how this works. I'll put it into the chat thread. Okay, so we've got Nick Dixon. He's been away and he's back in.
Ian, do you want me to show the slides again? I'm living in dread of this now.
Well, I'll tell you what we can do. If Lyndon agrees, if we have Lyndon's first page,
yeah,
and then after people have answered, because I think it would be really good for people to have space to particularly respond to Lyndon, and then Sharon, if we could pull up the questions that are in the chat thread in about 15-20 minutes time.
Fabulous. I'll keep an eye on the chat. Thanks.
Okay. So let's see where we're up to. Shall I say welcome back?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, are you okay? Is there something wrong with you?
The majority of people are on mute. I don't know whether everybody can hear us or not. We were just catching up, the three of us, in the break, and we're just keeping an eye on the time. We would like, as we said before, to welcome everybody back to the second half of this presentation. We would
have a look, darling.
We're hearing a variety of people having a natter, which is, as is the way. If people wanted to now rejoin, and perhaps can I invite anybody to respond to and come on screen and ask questions to Lyndon prompted by his presentation. So this is the first part of what we'd like to do now, is just give sort of 15-20 minutes, see how we go with any questions that we may have to us, Lyndon. I don't know whether anybody, I will invite a few people by name for their reflections and their thoughts. Welcome, John Holford, with the books in the background. Great to see you, John. John, I wondered whether, as name checking you earlier around that whole notion of policy trail, and as another person who was a Centenary Commission commissioner, any thoughts or reflections on Lyndon's presentation? Anything that it provoked and prompted for you?
Well, thank you. Am I hearing you? Are you hearing me?
Yes,
Rob?
we are.
Okay,
yes.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I have to apologize because I was late, because I had this in my machine saying it was starting at 10:30. And although I came in 10 minutes early, I was obviously rather later than the starting date. So I missed I missed the first few minutes, I think, of what Lyndon said, and certainly whatever was said before Lyndon said anything, which I take it was by Sharon.
Yes, well, Sharon and I doing the introduction.
So I missed those. What comes? The question that comes to mind, Lyndon, is this question of you mentioned Tawney and Tawney's class. One of the things about Tawney's class, as I recall, is that the Longton class carried on for years, decades after Tawney stopped teaching it. I remember when I was working in Hong Kong, one of the significant features of one of the early heads of the department was that he had taught Tawney's class at some point in the past. So I really wondered whether there's any way in which we can explore the significance of that class as it carried on over decades for the I don't know, shall we say, the political character, the social development, etc., etc., of Stoke itself. You know, is there any way of seeing whether it made a difference rather than to in a long-term sense continuously over the decades, rather than just being able to say, okay, those first in Tawney's day, there were those kind of interesting people involved, and they were affected.
Well, sounds as though there's a kind of research project there, or a bit of writing to it, doesn't it, John? Of course, the Longton class led to classes in other parts of Stoke, and the ripple effect was considerable via the North Staff's higher education movement, as I've suggested. What I think Rose does very well is then to chronicle the kinds of positions that those students moved into. Some, as I said, becoming teachers, many becoming political activists, or were already political activists when the class started in 1908, or later classes started. I mean, to fast forward to the early 1970s, I was involved a bit at Stoke then, and I came across various people then, we're now in the early 1970s, who'd been part of that movement. I think my own view, and to some extent this is guesswork in response to your question, is we cannot underemphasize the importance of that class in terms not just of an educative influence in Stoke and North Staffordshire, but in terms of the kind of preparation of a generation of leaders. And I think that was enormous. When I talk about many of the things that came about in Stoke in 42 and later, it's the ripple effect that's still at work. I think in the early 70s and on a little bit, that ripple effect was beginning to dissipate, although there were still rumblings. I still was able to have conversations with particular people later, but it was a very rich piece of work to do. I have to say, I think Raymond Williams and Richard Henry Tawney, have often been juxtaposed one against the other. I think they were, whether they would call it so, comrades in arms, they were together, and I think they come from the same spirit of liberal inquiry. And I think the contribution of all that to municipal socialism and its dynamics is not to be underestimated. I think it's a piece of work I'd love to do, John. Maybe it's something you and I should talk about a bit more.
Yes, I mean, if I can come back on that, one of the things that I can recall from my time in Kent in the 1980s was teaching for, I don't know, I can't remember, a year or two or three, a class in a political education class in Maidstone, which had been going on for years and years and years and years and years. And one always had a feeling that it played a part in the politics of the town.
Yeah.
And now how you and that, I mean, I don't know, I don't suppose it still exists, but that in some way it educated people, and it had connections with the Fabian Society and the Labour Party and blah blah blah. I just wonder how you. I think although the attendance at that stage would not have been deeply working class, I suspect it made a difference to the civic community, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. My view as well is that we need to learn new things about this work. I think there was a generation, and I've alluded to them, that view it in very rationalistic terms. Look, they didn't contribute to making a revolution, how terrible they were, and they were only social democratic, they weren't proper socialists, etc., etc., etc. I mean, I think I draw on my experiences and thinking about, informed by people like Honneth and Winnicott and others, just the importance of, turning up in a space. You're maybe an elementary school teacher, you're a woman. God, do I belong here? All those feelings that, in a sense, we've all had. And, chronicling the small moments that make a big difference. So, I mean, I've talked in other contexts about, the student who tries to say something and the throat kind of seizes, dries up, and you can't get the words out. But, the small, beautiful moments of the good tutor who says something like, well, were you trying to say something? And, perhaps that connects with, and that moment of delicate transition from being an outsider and wondering whether you stay here into becoming part of, and this, I think, is Lawrence Goldman's new point in 2014 with his biography of Tawney, right at the end, becoming part of a learning, living democracy. And to bring back the life, the lived experience of that is incredibly important. So in a sense, it's going back to old history, but I think it's seeing it in a new, more human, more dialogical light.
Yeah. Lyndon, I wonder whether we could just relate in a sense that the history and the contemporary forms. And I'm reminded of that discussion you and I had with Sharon on Wednesday, where we were reflecting on institutions like the WEA. We were then talking about new forms of informal lifelong and life-wide learning. And it's the link, and I'm delighted that we're joined by Jill, Becky and Brenda from the New Vic Theatre today, and I'm just following some of the chat thread. I wonder whether any of colleagues joining us today, Jill, Becky, Brenda, I wonder whether you'd got any reflections generated by listening to Lyndon and how what Lyndon was talking about relates to some of your own work at the New Vic Theatre. It's an invitation, you don't have to, but I'd just be really interested in your perhaps first thoughts.
Ian, sorry, can I just butt in?
Yeah.
On behalf of Scylla, I know she has to go early and it's hard to butt in on your own behalf. She's had a hand up for ages.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Sorry, Ian,
I didn't see
I know
that.
you might not have seen it. Apologies. Right, yeah.
You're on mute,
Scylla. Sorry.
Many apologies, and I will be very brief because I very much want to hear in the time I've got left from the people you invited in. But I just wanted to say thank you to Lyndon and also to sort of link that perhaps more contemporaneously, just by giving one maybe comparable example, Lyndon, where we're thinking about the pedagogy of this sort of learning and how rich that associational peer learning is. You gave some great examples in Stoke of, for example, the makers who were participating in the sewing, the learning they were doing from that, the way that was developing a collectivism. And of course, that collectivism that, we know is so powerful within the workplace, in the sort of organizations you drew upon. But we also see this so much in cultural forms. And I just wanted to say very briefly that I was talking at Feral Art School, which is a great co-op in Hull last weekend. And it was full of people who who through peer learning were reflecting on their own experiences, autobiographically, historically, but also how they could be activists in the future in terms of dealing with the times we're in. So that sort of pedagogy, which the arts is particularly rich in, it's about trust, because actually something like, certainly others on the call will know better than me, it's about putting yourself out there. It's about asking people to critique you, to collaborate, to co-produce. it's very much about letting go of power as an individual often, but actually building something together. So I guess that's very true in theatre as well. So the pedagogy, I think, Lyndon, in what you were describing is very liberatory and exciting in terms of working out towards challenging what the state we're in. But thank you for that. So thanks for inviting me in on that, everyone.
Yeah, think of an artist just taking a risk, and maybe, I mean, some of the examples I gave from Centre Space Arts. I mean, you know, you're new to this, and you're taking a risk, and you don't know whether it's any good, and you probably perceive intuitively bullshit, people just saying things. But then after a while, where you create something, and someone who's in a kind of tutor role says, "I'm really interested," that's absolutely fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about it? So you're into storytelling. And it's almost as though you're creating something above and beyond the two individuals. You're creating a sense of a dialogue, a sense of commonality. Maybe somebody else comes in and makes a contribution and starts contributing. You're building community. You're building these precious blocks of solidarity that we so desperately need. And going back to John's point, that's the thing I think I want to increasingly emphasize, and maybe was neglected in some of the earlier writing about the history of adult education. These are the tissues, they're human tissues that make a community, that make something work and make the soul sing. I mean, I'm quite open to the old religious language, and my God, earlier adult educators were. So I think we need a refreshment of perspective and a focus on the kinds of things that you're talking about to bring things alive again. And if they're alive, others will be interested.
Yeah, I mean, Scylla's example there of the Feral Art School, absolutely fascinating, and it's something I hadn't heard of. And although I am familiar, having grown up in North Staffs myself with the New Vic Theatre, that was why I suppose I picked up on and connecting with that and today's focus. But so that was excellent. Scylla's point there, and definitely to kind of follow up. So we've got perhaps another, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes for people, anybody's further responses to Lyndon's presentation. And I need to just make sure this time I'm seeing if anybody's putting a hand up. Anybody else want to ask Lyndon any particular,
or make any points? Yeah.
Sharon, anything yourself when you were listening to what Lyndon was saying?
I was just curious as to whether Brenda or anyone from the Vic wanted to come back on that, because I don't know. I can only see Brenda on my screen at the minute. Apologies, okay. I'm not trying to pick on you. I just
can see Jill's unmuted, so I'll perhaps give people. And this isn't an obligation; it's just an opportunity.
No, I was just going to say thanks, Ian, and thank you, Lyndon, as well. That was as well as being incredibly fascinating, it was really beautiful as well to describe the landscape that we live in. I was just thinking as you were speaking and just reflecting on the fact that at the moment, in the current climate and following the recent elections, that social cohesion feels almost more important than ever, really. And what's really key in what you were speaking about is that adult education isn't just about the development of the individual. It is about that solidarity and that coming together, which is why many of the cuts that we're facing to that programme and many of the cuts to culture, which plays a similar role, is so frightening, really, because actually that becomes yet another challenge to the voice of the people and the voice of people who are not in privileged positions but can make their presence felt through those challenges and through the challenges that they face, through those channels that we can provide. So that was going through my mind as you were speaking, and also the fact how history comes back to us. And we do have a Liditza Street now, which you will know about in Hanley, and actually even walking down it sort of lifts your heart a little bit as well, makes you feel like, yes, we're still connected and we won't forget that. I'll just speak just very briefly on the point that I wanted to make, and hopefully something specific about Raymond Williams as well. So I think many people here will know about the work of our founding director, Peter Cheeseman, who was a pioneer of the social documentary, the theatre documentary, and many famous plays, including Fight for Shelton Bar, which Lyndon mentioned, the famous Steelworks Shelton Bar, the Notty about the North Staffordshire Railways, and more contemporary ones such as Nice Girls, about the wives of miners who occupied a local mine during the strike in the 80s. But I think I want to just reflect on the fact that obviously time does move on, and although we're not making those documentaries in that format now, unlike a lot of theatres, we don't have a second space. We don't have a studio space, because our second space is in the community. That is our second space. And so we're still creating those pieces of theatre around the voices of local people. And obviously I've got Becky is here from New Vic as well, and Brenda is the co-chair of our resident intergenerational company, Ages and Stages. And Ages and Stages are currently working on a Raymond Williams inspired project, which Becky is also leading on as well. And I don't know, Becky or Brenda, if you wanted to say just a very few words about that documentary and the collaboration with Keele University, which is also really key to that. We're in an early stage of it, but I don't know if you want to say one or two words, just in case people are interested in, finding out how it progresses. If Becky, if you wanted to do that. Becky's desperate too.
Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button quick enough. Yeah, we're at the sort of early stages of our discussions with the group, which has been really fruitful, I think, in these last couple of weeks of understanding how many stories are out there and the impact it's had on multiple different pathways for people. So whether that's, from mining, or whether that's having a change of direction through into social work, and then the impact that's had on both personally, but then as community-led as well. So during our project, we're really keen to share those stories and provide an outlook of hope. I think as Jill was sort of saying this, it feels quite daunting to think that there's lots of cuts going on and where opportunities are perhaps being diminished. And so part of this project is to share that work, share, the legacy that Raymond Williams has and still has today, and how we can use that to sort of inspire a next generation to find new pathways that perhaps might be in a bit more of a challenging circumstance going forwards in terms of funding and the uncertainty that we might be in, and also knowing, I guess we yesterday we had one of our sessions which was led by David Amagoni, one of the lecturers from Keele University, who's very passionate about Raymond Williams and his footsteps, trying to kind of link that back to how this all started. And actually we can probably take some inspiration from that to go that it didn't come from government. So how can we then sort of instill that into some of the organisations within the community and representing that community voice. So hopefully it'd be great to kind of keep everybody here in the loop with what we're doing with that. And we're really very grateful for other people's insights to kind of feed into the project as well. And today's been really useful. So thank you, Lyndon, because certainly kind of that context relation to Stoke-on-Trent as well, being within our community. But it's fantastic to sort of get the perspectives of lots of other people as well to kind of understand more about this huge legacy that Raymond Williams has provided.
I think I just want to quickly say it's wonderful for me to feel these vibes of energy. And I think to share that and to share the sense that we're not alone, we're doing things that are distinct and beautiful, but relate to what others are doing. We have opportunities here to build new kinds of communities. I'm also mindful of another point that comes to mind, that when folk are struggling, whether it's in the Portland Inn project or whatever, one of the things we could usefully do is to build dialogue with other communities and other places, and to realize that sense we're actually all human beings and we're struggling with much the same sort of thing, and how good it is to be able to talk to somebody from somewhere else. That can be so empowering. So I see this work, the work of the research circles, working with people like you, is so important in creating a new vibrant set of possibilities.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that listening to those examples that triggered by the presentation, Lyndon, is really interesting to listen to Jill and Becky. And I wonder whether, you were talking there about connecting with others, Lyndon. Can I invite Keith from the Northeast to either respond to that issue or a related point? Keith, it's great to have you with us. Your thoughts. I can see your hand up.
Thank you, Ian. Yes, I will react to the last point that Lyndon made, because I think it is incredibly important that there was a huge history of international solidarity work that was carried out both by the WEA and by trade unions. Certainly in the Northeast, we were like a hotbed of that kind of activity. And a lot of it's disappeared. I mean, it's collapsed. It doesn't happen anymore. And when you look at the friendships that were developed through all that work, they were incredibly powerful. The WEA had trips to Scandinavia and, developed practical skills sessions based on that experience. The union I worked for, NUPI, had profound links with Cuba, with South Africa, and with Palestine, and which were, friendships that you could never, exchanges of things that you could never really replicate anywhere. And I think in many ways that's not been properly recorded. I mean, you referred to the Kent miners. I was well aware of their activity internationally, but there was also similar sorts of activities with Durham miners.
Yeah.
And I think we neglect that history a lot now, and I think it does need to be rediscovered. And I mean, I think there's a lot of potential there. Can I make one other final comment? I think both the Labour Party and the WEA have lost their democratic basis. And I think it's a big regret for us in the Northeast that that kind of tradition of involvement of members in its activity has disappeared. And if you look at the Labour Party, a lot of the new MPs were placed. They weren't partly elected by a constituency or the local people. And I think you get the result, which is that democracy it doesn't mean anything for lots of parts of the Northeast. Why would we be involved? Why bother? So I think it's a big problem to recreate proper participatory democracy.
Yeah. I think that tension between the local and how that plays out both regionally and nationally was very powerfully highlighted last week in those local elections. Sorry, I've got noise out my window. I'll go and shut the window in a minute. Lyndon, I wonder whether you'd got any thoughts to pause at this point, and then we could perhaps look at the two overall questions as to whether there's reflections. I'm just going to go and shut my window. Okay.
Thank you, Keith, for that. I kind of ended up almost by accident researching the Kent miners. We began in the early 1990s when I moved to the University of Kent. But we did some oral history work. We didn't make much of it. And then with the opening of the new Miners Museum at Bettshanger in the Kent coalfield, it kind of came alive again to me. And the Kent miners were extraordinary. I'm sure the Durham miners, I'm not wanting to claim any exceptionalism here, but the Kent miners were extraordinary in terms of the range of international contact. And I do mean miners. I mean people were going from Kent all over the world, some of the countries that you've mentioned, and bringing back enthusiasms. And one of the great tragedies is that, for instance, tragedy in more way than one, that one of the trips they made was to the old Yugoslavia, and work was being done on ecological issues and conversion issues. And they were formulating proposals for the development of the coal field and for mobilizing the skills that did exist in new ways. But of course, the political temperature of the times had changed so dramatically, and they were just dismissed. The other thing I would say is that in the history work I was doing and listening to the stories, I couldn't help but think, and I'm not wanting to make a partisan point here, but there was an aspect to the Brexit debate which was so distressing. You know, the kind of European other, the dismissiveness towards people from other places and other cultures. And what I was trying to do in the work, and we had an exhibition in the Kent Miners Museum, we had lots of old miners talking, was to say, hang on. Dads and granddads knew different things here. Let's listen to what they have to say about working with people from other places. About 1968, and again, it's controversial, but I'll mention it. You can see pictures of a big demonstration in Dover against the Vietnam War. And who were there? All kinds of people from Viet Cong and God knows who else, but a large contingent of French miners. And expressing solidarity. And during the 84-5 strike in Kent, the miners' unions, alongside other unions in France, really mobilized, and food parcels poured into the Kent coalfield. I find this inspirational, but I find it inspirational partly because these precious tissues linking people one with another, learning from one another, rather than the kind of stereotypical, fragmented nightmare that opens up in kind of social media. And when we neglect the building of the tissues of dialogue and understanding of the other. In understanding of the other, of course, the central idea is that we come to understand ourselves better. So important. And we have to find ways of talking back to power about these issues.
Great. Just following on from that, if I may, Ian, Lyndon, some really good comments coming up in the chat, which I know you will have seen or possibly will have seen. And I think in a way they kind of respond to the questions, which I'm just going to post again. I know, because I think we're answering them or responding to them in a way through the conversation with Lyndon. So some fantastic examples in the Durham area. Joe talks about Spennymoor, the Sketching Club, the Pitman Painters, who met in Ashington. Darlene refers to London, a play in London about the Pitman Painters. And then a lovely comment from Anne about a sold-out community performance of Breck's Mother Courage in a local mining village, Hordern in County Durham. And this goes back to Keith's point about listening and responding to local people and their interests. And sadly, the result that we get is that we now have a reformed county councillor, which, you know, is mirrored in my experience in Mansfield and Ashfield, where I live in northeast, in North Notts. And then Tim's referring to some work going on in Wales, in the Crumlin Navigation Colliery, and some hope there about it being restored. Soon a variety of new social spaces, large and small. And this is very much about arts, community activism. And just a quick reference to a link I put in the chat earlier, which will make sure the chat materials come out to you all afterwards, about my brother's film, which is about Wales, and which we're going to feature in the September event. So we are seeing, I think, some real examples here of the arts in action and responses to our questions about how we enrich the possibilities of lifelong learning.
Sharon, a very quick response.
Yeah.
I'm feeling it inside. What you're doing as you're talking and what's happening in the chat thread is that we are chronicling things that some of which I didn't know about. I'm sure others feel the same. We are in a work, as it were, creating something, some connections that didn't previously exist. The other point I wanted to make, and I deliberately said this in the title, we tend to assume, you know, historically that everyone knew. Maybe we don't think about it. Everyone knew the outcome before anything happened. So, you know, in the Tawney tutorial class, we lead to the social settlement of 1945 and the welfare state, etc. It wasn't like that at all.
No.
You know, previous generations have had to struggle against immense things. We're just at VE Day, you know, the Second World War. Think of nothing more horrific and everything that went on under that umbrella. So I think it's important to have this dialogue amongst ourselves in a contemporary way, but also to, as it were, relive, reimagine, refeel, which is a word I know you use in your work, refeel just what it must have been like for someone, you know, struggling to make sense of fascism and talking about these things and trying to resist it in their own communities. Such important things, stories of heroic action, actually, at some level, and we're seeing some of this documented now in the chat thread.
Absolutely. So, Ian, shall we? Are there any other comments and questions that developing those responses to perhaps the two questions? I think we've got some responses, as I've said, already emerging. And just a quick plug for the Raymond Williams Foundation, for those who don't know of our work. With my other hat on, I'm chair of the Raymond Williams Foundation, and we're a small but active charitable organisation or community organisation, however you want to define us. And we are committed to social justice orientated adult education. We know that, you know, such financial support for such activities is in really short supply, and we do targeted grants. I just wanted people to know about that in case you've not come across it. Obviously, we're passionate about Raymond Williams teaching, thinking, theoretical kind of positioning. So that's our deep commitment to community-based collective learning. But I know we don't always sell ourselves too well, and I always sometimes forget that I'm here with a double hat on. So I just wanted to remind everyone while I can that source of funding is available. We have a targeted grant scheme, and I wanted to let you know we also have the space. And I'll mention this again at the end, if this is all right with Ian. We have our YouTube, Raymond Williams YouTube site, is where we host all of the previous. And this one will go on the previous events under the Research Circle aegis, and they're all on the Raymond Williams Foundation website, recorded and for posterity. So please do have a look at it. I'll make sure everybody gets that link. Just wanted to say that.
Sharon, am I right then that as a follow-up to today, as well as circulating the chat thread in the form that we've got it, I'm just thinking of people like Andrew, who's with us today from South Staffs, and the work he's developing in Walsall, just as an example, that if people wanted to bid for funding, we'll circulate that link out to everybody.
Yeah, you can send that out, and it's all in the chat as well. Make sure everybody gets the chat. That I've put the links in the chat.
Yeah, because I thought that two very brief points, that when we've watched and learnt from that Portland Inn work, as well as the new Vic work that's been spoken about, for me, what's really striking then is that expansive definition of what we mean by the arts. You know, so yes, we've talked in the chat thread there about examples to do with painting. We've got examples to do with theatre, but what I found so fascinating, excuse me, about that Portland Inn project was that weaving together of gardening, architecture, various forms of community arts, working with different generations together. So, am I right, Sharon, that Raymond Williams funding itself is expansive in the opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, we appreciate it's only a small part.
Yes.
You know, we're only a small organisation, as you know, but we are really interested in self-initiated adult education, community-led, grassroots, basically.
Excellent.
And we support that kind of activity directly through our small grants provision.
The Portland Inn issue reminds me. Ian and I listened to Anna's inspirational professorial inaugural lecture, and I don't know whether it was there or wherever, just the kind of sources she drew on in that, including, again, going back to Kent, as a piece of oppositional art, as assertion in the face of appalling prejudice, making reference to Derek Jarman's garden in Dungeness and what that represented as a place of peace and care for soul work, to provide the resources of hope to go back in the struggle, against awful prejudice. And the way she drawing on capability Brown and somehow applying things that might at one level feel culturally other and distant, and bringing that down to a grassroots level, to a neighborhood of 500 houses, and saying, well, how can we make this a healthy place to live? How can we make it a dynamic place to live? How can we make it an ecologically alive place? So we get into the business, how can we bring back nature in all its forms and become part of a community, in a sense, with nature? We are nature. So it's quite inspirational and shows what you can do. And I'm sure other organizations like the theatre are doing similar things. And my God, we need to begin to learn more from each other in this kind of inspiring way.
Yeah.
Totally.
Something I was really struck by that you said, Lyndon, as well, how sometimes we reflect differently in our own lives at different points in our own lives. And I think there's something about the value of history that's coming out in the entire chat thread, and how it's not some kind of, I know we all agree with this, but, it's not some kind of dead form. It's so informative about a way forwards as well. I know we've all said that, and we talked last year about being backwards travellers to try and inform the present, but also to plan and develop the future, and how we respond to these many and myriad challenges. And I've just been struck by Joe's comment, about perhaps we need art to capture community life in the deindustrialised mining communities of today for the education of future generations. There is something about those stories that get lost, and that we have an incredibly important function in remembering. And it's something you said quite a few times, Lyndon, about the importance of remembering.
Yeah.
And this is also something that John's written about, and that Ian alluded to, the policy trails, kind of moving beyond policy. It's also about the stories and memories of communities. Something I just throw this in just because I'm passionate about it myself, in a former mining community, as you know, myself. The idea of there's so much power in the concept, I think, of reconnecting with those kind of histories, and I think we need, to work collaboratively on that. Is something we're trying to do here in the research circle.
History brought alive. I don't know whether I told you, but in the contribution you made, I think it was the last research circle seminar, talking about your dad, and who died not so long ago. But in a sense, one of the miners in Kent listened to it, and the way he talked about it was that it was almost as though you were bringing him alive again. In making the connections between the two of you, and you had this sense of strong relationship, of mutuality, of something which was bigger than the two individuals.
Yeah.
A sense of energy and new life being born. And that, to me, is part of the reason to have interest in history. It's not some dead past thing you put on a shelf. It can be alive, and the people that we're talking about in the chat function, as with your dad, can help us to bring these things alive again and provide resources of hope and energy for the struggles we have here and now.
Yeah, how they responded.
Absolutely. Is it worth, Sharon, do you think at this point, because in the introduction we talked about how today's event connects with what we're beginning to map out and plan for September, is it worth just doing a very broad preview of some of the outlines of how we see September connecting?
Yeah, so we've got colleagues and and friends on the call today as well from other parts of the world. I'm thinking Bud and Darlene are both here, for example, who I had the privilege of spending the day with yesterday.
Laura's here from Italy.
And Laura's here from Italy. I just think what we're really hoping to do with the September event, and again, as has probably been made clear, we were hoping some of these events might be face to face, but being really frank with everybody, you know, we have the same issues about people's time, having any funding to organise face-to-face events. Things we'd love to do have become more and more difficult during this last year. We're serious about having an event in Stoke and in Wales, and I was looking at Merthyr Tydfil and various other potential areas to host the event, but it's become more and more apparent that it precludes people from outside the sphere who can't travel easily. Firstly, there's all the cost implications that we are constantly fighting with. And we as a research circle, just to quickly say, put in a bid to the Emil Melbourne Trust last year with a view to funding 3 events in key communities. We talked about Stoke as being one, certainly Wales, and we were hoping to do one potentially in the North East Midlands in the area where I live, but these haven't come off. But it does in a way allow us the space to talk to colleagues from other communities across the globe who are having similar experiences. And I can say that categorically from some of the presentations I was privy to yesterday from Canada and also from the US. And I think there's something really inspiring about the notion of storytelling. This is something I've just noticed Bud's put up in his comment. We're really passionate, I think, about bringing stories alive, connecting history with the present, but as a resource for future activism and arts-based activities. Not because he's my brother, but because I think his work's brilliant. My brother's created quite a beautiful film about intergenerational memory loss in Wales, and how he's focused on a couple of young people from a particular school in Abertary area of Wales, and he discovered that they had no knowledge of their own history. So he used certain older activists to kind of, they worked with and talked to the young people, and they were absolutely certain they were going to leave the area. They had no relationship with Wales, and that they'd have to flee Wales to get any kind of, to have any chance of a life and a career in the future. And by the end of the film, which is, I've put the link again in the chat, and it's quite clear that they've learned through learning about the history that there's a prospect of a future in their own community. And I think this is kind of really what we want to try and focus on in the September event in Wales, or celebrating elements of work in Wales, but hopefully sharing stories from other communities as well, given that we're going to be online now. Certainly I've asked my brother if he can come. It took him a year to create the documentary, and he's very willing to come. Well, in this case, he won't be coming. He'll be on screen talking about the creation of the film, the conversations with political figures, the conversations with the students, with activists, with former miners, etc. And he will present the kind of creative processes that he went through and the kind of thought processes. And I just thought that'd be really helpful for us to have something kind of explored in that sense about the process of making art to reflect political and social and economic struggle, but also the possibilities for the future. So that's what we're hoping to do. We're hoping also to have colleagues here who are here from Stoke come along, and I do hope that people from different communities will come to the September event. We haven't got a date yet, but that's partly because it was originally going to be face-to-face, so we've had to kind of flip that round and so on. And I just wanted to comment that Bud's made a point here, which I think is really interesting. He said he will share this information with the UNESCO Chair Network, which community-based participatory research is really, in terms of practice, the same kind of process that we're talking about here as community-led learning. So there's a real sense that we can start to share collaboratively across several parts of the world, I think, and continue that work with a focus on Wales. Tim Pellison, who supports and works with Adult Learning Wales, has also said that he'll make sure that we have access to the Crumlin navigation colliery testimony, which would be fantastic. So that's just a kind of bit of a preliminary about what we're doing in September. A bit vague as yet, but it's developing rapidly.
An outline. It's in development.
Yes, in development.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I think that we put in a lot of time around November, December last year, hoping, as Sharon was saying, to have these online face-to-face events. We didn't realise, perhaps we were naive, the number of people who were applying for funding from Emile Melbourne, but we've continued with the shape of what we've begun today. And we will be working on that event over the next, over the next 6 to 8 weeks. And I think one of the things that we would really welcome is from today, everybody is very welcome to join us in September. I think that richness of the people from various parts of England, but also to have participation from Wales and Scotland and the international dimension has been brilliant. It's been really, really strengthened today. But if you yourselves think that there are other key people and other key organisations who could join us in September, do let Sharon and I know, and we'll make sure as we're shaping the event with Lyndon and colleagues for September, we'll make sure that we directly invite people to join us. And I think, today has been, well, more than I thought it would be, actually. I mean, these events are always fascinating, but this has generated an immense range of ideas. So I'd like to thank Lyndon for all of the work he's done in putting this together, and everybody for their contributions. Sharon, are there any further thoughts we want to emphasise, don't we, about the chat thread, and also the point about the film, because there's the people who weren't able to be here but want to be able to watch back. Yeah,
just a final comment again in the chat thread, but the Raymond Williams Foundation YouTube link is in the chat. I'll make sure it's there as well in any covering emails, so everyone has access to this and is able to see it. It's basically, we have as I said earlier, we have an archive, if you like, of all the events over the last 4 years since we started the research circle, and lots of other films. Quite a lot of work around Culture is Ordinary, Raymond Williams, some brilliant film work as well connected to Culture is Ordinary, and various other links to explainers about Raymond Williams' conceptual and theoretical kind of works on the Raymond Williams Foundation website. So I'll just make sure that everyone has access to that. And thanks everybody for these contributions in the chat thread, are absolutely fascinating. And to thank Andrew and Olga and Jill for the comments that they've added, and those links, because I didn't know about that unfinished histories link, Jill. So that, and the work that you and Becky were talking about earlier, would be really interesting to kind of keep up with what's happening there. And I know, as I said in the introduction, I know from the conversations we've had over the last couple of weeks that both Anna and Claire, we look forward to inviting them to join us as part of the September event as well. Lyndon, I wonder whether there's any final thoughts today that you'd like to just add before we pull it all together.
I just feel, I don't know how other people feel, just looking at the chat thread and the rich number of projects that people are talking about. I mean, I feel very moved, actually, and there's lots I don't know. And one of the purposes of doing all this, I think, is to generate kind of dialogue between us about all these things. We can only know so much. Mention the importance. It's implicit in my work of particularities. But I think in all these projects, there's so much to learn, and we have to find the space where we can give each of them some time, and that will be over a period, because they make me ask all sorts of questions. I mean, I wish I could spend more time, and probably will do if I can kind of arrange something with Anna and the others. More time in Stoke as well. I think I've only touched the surface of the Portland Inn project. I was really pleased that the new Vic were here, and I'd love to come and talk to them as well about the work they're doing. I do have some street cred in this regard. I did know Peter Cheeseman, not well, but I did. And the old Vic, because again, I hear stories or hints because of my continuing contacts with Stoke, but I don't know the depth of some of what has been done. So I don't just want to know about Shelton Bar and what was done in the past. I want to know something about the present and how we can, the whole can be more than the sum of the parts. That's coming into my head just at the moment. The whole is more than the sum of the parts, and it's materializing before our eyes.
Yeah. Excellent. That captures it.
Just before you go, Lyndon, a couple of questions. Apart from your presentation, I know a lot of it was you spoke very richly to each slide. So do you have perhaps a copy of your talk broadly? Because people might be interested in seeing that as well as the slides.
I do, and that can be made available. I often do these things off the cuff, and I thought,
I know you do, but I thought I were hoping you hadn't this time.
No, I thought this is too important. I'm channeling something here, some historical legacy that's so important. I wanted to kind of do it justice. So I have got something I could send.
I'll send that out. Thank you so much, Lynn. That's brilliant. And I just thought it was wonderful and inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Sharon, do you want to? Should we pull it together and?
No, that's fine. Yeah, my cat's trying to get in on the act now.
Oh well, if your cat's trying to get in.
God.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that sounds like a good point to pull.
It really is. Yeah.
So over the next week, what we'll do is perhaps rather than writing to people in dribs and drabs, we'll pull together the chat thread. We'll pull together, if you agree, Lyndon, the text of your talk, and we will write out to everybody with one message with the resources generated by today, and then we look forward to welcoming everybody in September to our next event. Okay. So thanks ever so much, everybody, for all of your participation and all of your contributions. It's been great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.